everyone. Today we have our another new episode and we will discuss on climate and health building economic resilience. We have our world famous speaker, Madam Ali Rice, and Mr. Rob Enderdy. Ali, how you want to define climate and health building economic resilience?
Okay, because and the research that I did, sadly, the world's most disadvantaged regions and people are disproportionately affected by climate change and health risks. And I think the most vulnerable communities have less infrastructure, less health services. So essentially, I guess they're kind of in survival mode, really. So I think the thing is, it's hard to imagine how things are in vulnerable communities unless you've been in them. So essentially, and there's obviously vulnerable communities around the world for different reasons, but definitely affected by climate change. There's because obviously the tropics in Asia and it's much more vulnerable to kind of extreme weather conditions. And so obviously, in the States, obviously the fire risks, that there's where we are in the UK, it's very unusual to have extreme weather conditions. Apart from this year, we had kind of an almost constant heat wave throughout the summer. So essentially, I think the thing is, in the UK, we all grumble about the weather being bad until it gets hot, and then everyone's too hot. So essentially, I think the thing is that climate change is evidently happening. And as I was just talking to Rob off air, and our temperatures haven't been quite as high as California, but our landscape hasn't been dissimilar. And I've spent 10 years working in California as well. So it's crazy how things have been different. And here we have hose pipe bans, so you can't use your hose in the garden. And it's a really, I don't think the last hose pipe ban we had was in 1970. So for me, essentially, I think the thing is that the people that run, that are in the countries have to be educated so that they're prepared for crisis and for emergencies. And essentially that's, it's education and strategies to deal with, like the worst case scenario need to be, you need to be run through companies and people in general. And the most vulnerable people are apparently kind of women and children. So, and also immigrant kind of populations as well. So I think there's so there's a whole lot of so I think the thing is the vulnerable societies and the vulnerable countries that are developing are obviously at more risk than anyone else. So and in some ways I think the Western world's responsible for making sure that there's some kind of contingency to help when things go wrong, because we've kind of caused a lot of the climate problems in the West.
Yeah, thank you. My next question for Mr. Rob: how do climate-related health risks such as heat stress, vector-borne disease, air pollution directly impact economic productivity and workforce resilience?
Well, generally, a happy workforce is a productive workforce. You don't want to be so happy that they're partying all the time, but generally, if a workforce is happy, this goes back to the work of Hertzberg and Maslow back in the 50s and 60s, indicating that if you can keep your workforce well fed, adequately paid, adequately compensated, and well housed and well, then you'll be able to optimize productivity. What happens, of course, is you have the influence of climate change. Illnesses go up, food goes down, clean water goes down. So the things that provide that base level of comfort and general contentment with the environment and work, those go out the window. And so the end result is you lose in productivity. I honestly think we should be measuring countries not so much on their economic proficiency, but on the happiness index of their population, and whether or not the population is happy, content, and relatively stress-free. And often the Scandinavian countries tend to rank towards the top, where a lot of the large countries like mine are ranked towards the middle or bottom. And so with a lack of focus on well-being, and even things like vacation time and downtime can make a difference. I was reading a story the other day about a U.S. guy that was working one of the European countries, and you think, I can't believe it. They have a 6-week vacation, and they're expected to take it. And here, here in the U.S., if you take a couple days off in a row, that's considered disloyal and unproductive. But the thing is, you burn out, and burnout workers don't do you any good either. You need some kind of balance in your life, and it's certainly important for more things than just your mental well-being. It's important for your kids, and they have some type of parental influence, and they don't get that if the parents are working all the time. And on top of that, as you exacerbate the pollution, the climate change, then you start losing arable land. Your costs of food go up, and because the amount of food you can produce go down, and you have significant problems with regard to keeping people fed. And then, of course, at the end, you have medicines, and the pharmaceutical industry is largely focused on profit, which means, as soon as you get well, you cease being a profit center and a problem. And so it's no wonder the pharmaceutical industry focuses on medications that moderate an illness, but really don't seem all that focused on medications that solve or cure an illness. Though, as we've seen in Europe, in Europe and other countries where they have mandated healthcare for the population, that they're actually making progress. They've got vaccines now in some of those areas for cancer, which is something that was unheard of for a while back. So that's something that's not being developed. In fact, a lot of the cancer development in the U.S. was just shut down this year because cancer patients are huge pockets of money, and if they're cured, they're not going to be all that profitable. So really, as we look at climate change and its overall impact on health, it has an adverse overall impact on productivity and employee well-being, and certainly also increases the probability of unrest. And unrest, of course, has a significant impact on productivity, adverse impact on productivity as well.
Thank you. My next question for Ali. What policy measures and financial model can help integrate health protection into national climate adaptations and economic resilience strategies?
When I was looking, actually, there was kind of 8 things that they were talking about, and one of those is health coverage, so kind of insurance for people, and I think kind of occupational health and safeguards as well. So I think kind of creating spaces so that people can keep cool if there's hot temperatures, and they can have regular breaks so that they can mitigate any kind of health issues. And risk monitoring as well. So essentially, kind of been aware of when the temperature's forecast to be highest and trying to avoid, the situations. Because I think it's in Arizona that people work in the evenings and avoid like midday, So essentially, maybe structuring things differently. So, and hold on a second. Also, kind of protecting critical systems that we need as well, so that that the infrastructure's there, and if there's problems with the way that things are done, that they strengthen where the kind of weaknesses and fragility is. So a sense, but I think kind of education and kind of making sure that people are aware of where the risks are and how to reduce them, so that that it's essentially that they're mitigated as opposed to dealing with the problems, as opposed to kind of avoiding the problems as opposed to having to deal with them.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. David Smith, for joining today's sessions. We are discussing about climate and health, building economic resilience. My next question for Mr. David Smith: what role can a cross-sector partnership between government, private sectors, and civil society play in reducing the economic burden of climate-related health crisis?
Cross-sector partnerships are very, very important today, because if you look at this whole domain space with climate and health, you're really in an area where climate change is no longer an environmental issue. It is not only just a health issue, it's also an economic disruptor. And you have to build, when you're building resiliency, which is what it's all about, it does require the cross-sector strategy. That link environmental sustainability, health protection, regulatory, economic stability all together. Because climate change is really sets disruptors in place where it amplifies the existing vulnerabilities in the infrastructure, within the human capital, within the health systems, within the economies, and all of these are usually stressed simultaneously. And so you begin to see that happen. I can give you a great example, Dr. Shree, that is close to my heart, and one that actually on some of your prior shows you got to see firsthand with me. Uh, Back in 2021, here in Texas, we had a once in a century freeze that lasted weeks and weeks. It disrupted our energy supply. It shut down hospitals. It shut down companies. It shut down first responders. Millions of people lost power for not a day, but for weeks. You could not travel anywhere, and everything has shut down. That resulted in billions and billions of dollars of economic loss. It resulted in climate impacts here uh, to a scale that some people never recovered from that. And so to me, that's an example of how, as you begin to look at the type of partnerships you've talked about, how you do that. We've actually here in Texas put in place new partnerships, new cross things to address with that on a broader scale now. And we've put tools in place, resiliency in place, and regulatory impacts in place that can impact with climate and health. And so that is a place where it was the catalyst to let us build economic resiliency in what we're trying to do here. I hope that helps answer your question, Dr. Shreve.
Thank you, Mr. David. My next question for Mr. Rob. Uh, how can vulnerable population, low-income communities, women, children, and elderly be better protected from the climate health risk to ensure inclusive and sustainable economic resilience?
Well, probably looking at the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund as an example of building resilience into an economic structure in order to take care of, and while that's mostly focused at retirement, the fund itself at $2 trillion allows a certain amount of latitude and provides the government with a significant financial capability of being able to change public perceptions, fund particular kinds of industries over others, and drive overall change. Plus, the fund itself, while targeted at mentioned retirement folks, could also be used to cover people that are homeless, that are unable to work because of their illnesses, and address other aspects of adverse impacts of climate change or just economics. It's also called the Whale Fund, but it was a brilliant creation by the Norwegian government, monitored and managed by their financial institutions, well, by the Norwegian bank for the most part, and the result is they've got a massive pool of money that they can use to address some of these changes. Another thing that can be done is large scale modeling and simulation, so you can best determine when and where the needs are going to emerge, and then pre-position resources against those needs. Unlike a natural disaster like a fire or flood, you have in many cases years to prepare for some of the jobless downturns, some of the increases in joblessness, and some of the adverse health impacts that we're anticipating. But if you don't create a simulation at scale, then while you're kind of thinking this is coming, you won't have a good idea of where or how big, and thus you won't be able to position the resources you need with adequate timing to actually be able to use them. So the good news is we've got time, but the bad news is that time is not unlimited, and governments often tend to wait till the last minute to address underlying issues, and that's why examples like the Sovereign Wealth Fund out of Norway are so important, because here was something that they put in place a long time ago, and it's paid huge dividends now. In the end, governments need to be able to function much more strategically than they currently do, because we need to be we have the foreknowledge and we have the technology to be able to model these problems well in advance of them becoming disasters. And yet we're not really doing that at the moment. And so that's got to change. But that's one of the areas where we can put some effort and make sure that governments out there are ready for some of the major changes that are coming.
Thank you. Madam Ali Rice, what you want to discuss about these questions as we discuss about low-income communities, women, children, and elderly? How can this vulnerable population be better protected from climate health risks to ensure inclusive and sustainable economic resilience?
Because I think a lot of times that in the local communities, that food provision, so that they're kind of growing their own food, or so that there's essentially a local resilience built up that's not necessarily pivotal on the government. So I think most of the vulnerable areas don't necessarily have the money or kind of government funding. So essentially they need to try and find resilience. So I think that kind of crucially. So there's been a massive in the UK. Some people will hold it and grow food. Sustainable, so that or having communities share orchards and allotments. And I think the thing is that we live 6 miles away from Evesham, 6 miles away from Stratford. Evesham is probably one of the 2 market kind of areas in the UK that used to source everything. So kind of being resourceful, but actually make the of the agriculture in the area, so that you're self-sustaining.
Thank you. Mr. David Smith, we want to discuss about impact investment. So how can investment in climate resilience healthcare infrastructure such as solar power hospital, telemedicine help safeguard public health while also generating long-term economic return?
Well, you've got some great examples in that question, Dr. Sri, because if you begin to look at how the investments are there, you're looking at how to ensure uninterrupted access to care during climate-related disasters like the extreme ice storms, snowstorms we had, floods, hurricanes, heat waves, other things like that. And the systems in the healthcare infrastructure that you talk about in the question, they are really need to be mitigated for the health risks by this climate change. You already have impacts with emergency visits, things like that. What I can tell you, what we saw here in Austin during the storm I mentioned earlier, we had over 7,000 additional emergency department visits of broken bones during that ice storm. And what's interesting is you could not drive to a hospital. You could not drive to the others because the roads were impassable. So you ended up having emergency vehicles go and do that, which even disrupted the healthcare access even more during an event like that. So you're there. Telemedicine didn't work well because you didn't have power in the homes. You didn't have communication lines. And so that type of disruption is a great example of how climate can be there. And how do you put investments in place with that? I can tell you some of the big changes here was for example, with the wireless networks, you put much more power generation capability out in the field. You began to look hard in the resources. One of the things we saw with climate change here is when you have 2 inches of ice and 4 inches of snow on top of solar panels, they don't work. And things. So even though Texas normally has a very robust solar injury to go and help us here, in climate disruptions, it goes away. Same with windmill power. The motors froze in the cold because we don't have to treat them here like I would if I lived up where Allie lives, because we don't have that type of cold. But then you have to do that. So the investments in the infrastructure to do things like that are critical when you look at the type of impacts we hear. So yes, solar powered hospitals are great as you begin to get there and there, because you see, for example, across Africa, UNDP used an initiative there uh, to put solar panels into over 1,000 healthcare centers. And the same thing, Africa has a lot of sun. So it really makes sense there and do it. Telemedicine, if you have the appropriate infrastructure, makes a lot of sense. But what we're seeing there is that you need to begin to match the infrastructure costs in it. We're seeing more and more sensors deployed for telehealth now to be able to do more and to have more impact. So you see that happening there. You're seeing now a lot more types of batteries and generators there. So if I begin to look at the benefit side, you're getting a diverse type of power generation, power storage put in place so that you have that type of impact. But the other side of that one is it also helps you create a cleaner environment as well. Same thing with remote access is if you can begin to do it. But the investments in climate resilient health infrastructure really create a cycle of protecting lives today while you're building capabilities, while you're building sustainability, while you're building regulatory and financial sustainability for tomorrow. And there's synergies when you do this with the things we talked about earlier. There's synergies across sectors like energy, telecommunications, healthcare, public infrastructure, urban planning. All of these have to come together to work as a creative group using the group intelligence that we talk about often to be able to address this type of challenge, Dr. Shree.
Thank you. Mr. Rob, what you want to discuss about investment, specifically investment in a climate resilience healthcare infrastructure?
Well, it's been paying off. A lot of the investment for that Norwegian sovereign wealth fund I mentioned earlier go into alternative forms of energy, and it's been very successful in that regard. The issue with many of the alternative forms of energy has been energy storage. For the most part, wind works typically from about early afternoon until mid-evening. Solar, of course, only really works during the day, though we do have some solar capability that can pull, that's efficient enough that can pull the reflected sun from the moon and operate that way at a substantially reduced level, but actually still generate. And we've made some modifications to windmills that they don't have to kill birds or cause some other problems. Though, to be clear, they've never driven whales nuts, and they don't drive, and they don't give people cancer. Both two things that came out of my government recently, which is just kind of frightening. So investments have paid off. There have been issues. I mentioned some windmill designs have been hard on the bird population, and early windmills, the blades were made in such a way that they couldn't be recycled. Those things have been fixed, and we have windmill designs that don't have blades anymore that work fairly efficiently. France has been kind of over and above what the what could be done in that regard. And so we made some significant strides. So overall, investment in these technologies has paid off greatly and provides an offset for the declining petrochemical industry as it goes into decline. And I think as we talk about subsidies, making sure your subsidies are aligned with your climate goals are important. Here in the U.S., we substantially over-subsidize petrochemical and substantially under-subsidize sustainable forms of energy, which in and of itself is not sustainable. And so you've got to make sure you don't do. I mean, as a guy speaking to the U.S. and saying, "Hey, don't do what we're doing because it's stupid." That's kind of what I'm saying. So you want the policy to be in line with your desire to create a sustainable environment, a sustainable planet, and have your citizens be happy, healthy, and less likely to overthrow the government that you've got. So that's it. I think the investment in if I was doing it, I'd put a lot more investment in both artificial intelligence as a way to manage these resources, because you can raise the efficiency that way. And then I'd monitor real heavily the advancements in energy storage that been making huge leaps and bounds this decade, and that provides, anytime you've got rapid advancement in a particular technology, it provides an opportunity for emerging economies in particular to leapfrog their peers because they don't have the existing infrastructure to replace. They can come in with the newer technology and be more efficient out of the box, but they have to be up to speed, and they have to make sure that they've got people trained in that technology so that they can implement it properly. You can't do with whether we're talking about artificial intelligence or advanced ways to generate or store power. This is not something you can suddenly say, okay, I want to do this and buy it. You have to build up an internal knowledge of how to do it properly, how to maintain it, how to tariff it, how to fund the overall effort before you do it. Otherwise, you're likely to fail.
Thank you, Madam Allardyce. What your experience about climate infrastructural development in UK, in Europe?
Okay, because that's what I've said before, that essentially, from what I know, I think there's just over 50% of our energy is produced sustainably now. And essentially, as I think most of the wind turbines that we used are on the coast, because it's obviously windy and it kind of doesn't ruin people's landscapes or views or anything. So, and essentially, then there's also solar power. There's so many houses that have solar panels now, so that I think they get to the stage when they produce electricity, so they can sell it back to the grid as well. So essentially, I think the thing is that we're much more in tune with being sustainable, but I think long term we're still very people dependent. So I think until we kind of resolve the issue of kind of transport, I think it's still going to be definitely, from our experience of ourselves, the infrastructure isn't there for everyone to have them anyway. And essentially, I just think kind of as once their batteries are run down, then there's kind of a waste problem as well, isn't it? It's more expensive to replace the battery than to replace the vehicle. So I think the thing is we're heading in the right direction, but I still think that we're not necessarily living as sustainably as we could do. And that also kind of it relies on kind of making conscious choices as well. And I think healthcare also depends on the individual and the family as well. So as women, I would say that we're probably the first educators for children to kind of eat healthily, exercise. Essentially, I think those fundamentals, essentially when I spent 10 years working in California, there was one extreme to the other. So people were either clinically obese or super fit. So essentially, I think the thing is that we have to, and I also think that agricultural and the food industry have a lot to answer for. At the moment, there's a documentary just about to come on, and there's this guy that's this fitness expert, but basically he's making a program about some killer kind of health bar that's essentially got things that should be banned but aren't, but apparently are allowed to be in our food system. So essentially, I think that we need to question everything about because the food industry should, I think, lie with the health industry, so they're not allowed to produce anything that's detrimental to our health. And essentially that, so, you know, I think it's really easy to kind of push junk food and not, you know, not kind of, so I think it's back to nature really, you know, and I think the thing is that the sustainable energy is harnessing nature. So I think the thing is we need to go back to basics and not rely on chemicals for any of it. And I also think, you know, it's our own health. So I think we've got much more ability to heal ourselves if, you know, as opposed to having lots of interventions. So, and it's, you know, touch wood, my family rarely ever go to the doctors and they've never had anything seriously wrong with them. So, you know, and essentially, so I've been to hospital twice. Both times I've been to hospital, I have, you know, both of my children. So, you know, so essentially, and I think it is about choices and well-being, and essentially happiness as well. So, and it helps if you're passionate about what you do as well. So, but I think kind of industry-wise, I think the thing is we still need to make kind of conscious choices, and that's always kind of been my effort really. So, and kind of also kind of raise awareness so other people do the same thing.
Thank you, Mr. David Smith. My next question's about community. So, in what ways can community lead adaptation strategies, such as natural-based solutions, indigenous health practice, contributions to both reducing climate-related health risk and strengthen local economic resilience, especially what is happening in Texas, Austin, if you share with our audience.
You know, the context-specific one is very good because it's there. Because you see nature-based solutions being put in place. You see urban greening. You see wetlands being restored. Here in Austin, you began to see the ability to look broader across our areas where what were some of the indicators that we have. For example, this is going to sound weird as a community side, but Texas is a very large state, and we actually have an energy grid that is separate from the rest of the energy grid across the rest of the United States. And so part of the community-led initiatives on this one was to diversify our grid more. We diversified it with different type of climate sustainability solutions. We went back and retrofitted some of the generators on this wind power to be able to work not just in extreme heat, which we already were there, but now extreme cold as well. So if I were to go and look at windmills generating electricity in Canada, up areas like that, they're designed to work in the cold, but they're not designed to work in heat. So you see failures there. So you have to begin to look at solutions as you say, community type, location centric solutions to be able to use. They're using part of my example here. You begin to look at things like how do you look at things like crop rotations? How do you look at how you can mitigate health results from pollution, from the ecosystem diverging? Dr. Sharif, you knew, for example, here we were in some extreme droughts, and the main lake from here was over 47 feet low. With the floodings we had here recently, where all the children and things died, that lake is now 100% full. So it came up actually that 47 feet in a 2-week time. That was a disaster, really. There were hundreds of kids killed and other adults, a massive property loss. That we've now even changed the floodplain rules for that. We've put more warning systems in place to let us know when that type of weather happens, and that's all community led there. You see, for example, in some of the urban areas, I was just last Friday, I spoke at the United Nations on use of AI for humanity. And what was interesting is one of the other presenters was talking about how every large city, like a New York City, like a Dubai, and others, need to change the tops of buildings to put plants on top of buildings for sustainability, and also to manage heat and other things like that. And so that is a community-based one that I thought was very interesting as we were sitting there. Uh, how do you draw on the local knowledge, though? If I look, for example, at the original people in Australia, how can we draw on their uh, knowledge to address fire management controls? The Aborigine people in Australia really did a great job before there was the science of doing controlled burns. And this is before this was hundreds of years ago, before we saw the science of how a controlled burn could give you that type of resiliency for healthcare, for all the other elements in there, and make it work. And how do you strengthen the local economic resiliency? Because as you look at your question here, Dr. Shree, it needs to be done for the most burnable to the top of the other as well. And how do you avoid expensive retroactive type of measures? How do you go and try to stay out of emergency response as much as possible? And how can you pull those pieces together? So really the strategy needs to be a dual strategy. How do you look at the immediate community-led health safeguards? How do you then work to make infrastructure and ecosystem-wide changes, but how do you keep the economic gains, the community gains by inclusiveness, sustainable models, and how do you scale them across your regions? And that requires really regulatory support, policy support. It's working with everyone else across the Technopolis to pull these together to be able to respond to a very, very diverse context of the resources you have there.
Thank you. My next questions to Madam Ali Rice, like what role should government, international donors, and the private sector play in ensuring the climate health financing reach vulnerable population most at risk from economic and healthcare shocks? Like what you want to discuss about government, international donors, and private sector's role for this community.
Well, because I think my brother-in-law works in the petrochemical industry, and his family have gone all around the world. So my twin sister and her family have gone all around the world, while his kind of set up plants or developed them or built them. And essentially, I think the thing is that all those petrochemical industries that originally, those companies are either based in the US or the UK, and essentially they go overseas to Asia or there's other places, Saudi Arabia, but essentially I think the thing is involved. I think they should also be responsible for the infrastructure and the environment, the consequences that global change brings. So essentially, and it's definitely over here. There was pressure for them to do a windfall kind of tax on all of the petrochemical industries because they were making so much money. And essentially, that they're the ones that are obviously polluting the air and the seas and the environment. So essentially, I think there should be more tax on the industries that are the worst polluters. And same as Coca-Cola's, essentially, I think there's more Coca-Cola bottles floating around the sea and our waterways around the world than there are. I think corporations need to be. I think the problem is that governments tend to work hand in hand with those corporations, so they don't want to upset them. And essentially, I don't think it is that they should take responsibility for what they do. And essentially, the carbon things like that, when we start, essentially those corporations need to be.
Thank you. Mr. David Smith, what's your thoughts about government, international donors, and the private sectors uh, in climate health and climate and health initiatives?
Well, there's a role for all of those, as we've already talked about going through some of them, because again, you have to build resiliency against them. You have to prioritize uh, the places of the greatest need, including things like low income communities. Uh, you need to look at the differences between the nation states and what they have available there. You know, some nation states really only receive a fraction of some of the global funds that are available to do this, and others have an abundance and help fund others. So you have to look at how the public and private sector can work together with this type of financing. You know, government, international donors each have distinct yet very complementary roles and how to uh, raise the money, distribute the money, track the government for compliance and transparency. Uh, and particularly in the climate area, the transparency between public and private sector financing has been one that have been inhibitors at times because the transparency wasn't there. And we have to look at new types of collaborative frameworks. You know, we've talked about public-private partnerships before and how those can work very effectively in this area. I can tell you, going back to the floods I mentioned earlier here, a little bit over a month ago, the public-private partnerships were the ones who provided the majority of the relief to the people killed, the property that was damaged, well before any government resources were there to work. You have to look at how you can take the public and private sectors and do what's called blended finance, which you really amplify the impact by de-risking the investment and by integrating health into the climate uh, claims there. That integration of them together are very important. I think if I look at the role of government, though, and we've just seen this in the Texas legislature here, you have to begin to develop uh, new ways to take commitments and make them actionable. Governments tend to serve as gateways, gatekeepers, and that often doesn't work well when you're dealing with a climate-driven emergency. So one of the things that needs to be happening at multiple levels, from city levels to state levels to nation levels to regional levels, is we have to develop a frameworks for coordinating mechanisms to look at how to allocate these funds based on the assessments we have of vulnerability, of impact, of others. You know, Rob was talking earlier, Nepal's has a local adoption plan, which takes a lot of community input into account for their climate resistant health infrastructure. And they put this into a national plan to prioritize co-benefits like regional hospitals and flood-prone areas there. You're looking in Africa, the same type of things, where they began to go back and taking the public and private sector together to do sub-national levels of frameworks, where they're looking at the at-risk groups and trying to prioritize them for which give you the access to the care there, but maintains the priorities for those vulnerable groups. And you're seeing another concept where you're looking at target areas, particularly where a large percentage of the global poor reside, trying to safeguard economic stability, health systems, and put in it. An example of that is in the Caribbean here. The country of Haiti is one of the poorest countries in the world, but yet they're impacted by major hurricanes, which totally destroy the energy, the communications, the healthcare resources there. And so, how can you look at pulling together these public-private sector collaborations to try to create a more resilient resource there on all of those? And it takes a not just a regional approach, it really takes a international approach where you have multilateral funds, you have agencies like the World Bank and International Development Bank and others. You need charities and foundations coming together to try to meet these type of targets. And one of the trends I've seen lately in some of the climate-based healthcare ones particularly, is they're taking a percentage of the fund, 5%, 10%, whatever, to finance the community and each of the local ones for oversight so that you get that back into it. Yeah. The International Federation of Red Cross Partnerships is a way where they're looking at how to put parametric type of insurance in place for these disaster-prone regions as a way to collaborate together to finance it, not just ahead, but how to respond afterwards if there's a disaster, and how to bridge the financial gaps and protect the people who are vulnerable from cascading failure. So, Dr. Sharif, I think that's probably a good answer for you.
Thank you. Thank you. My next questions to Madam Ali Rice. How can climate resilience health system integrated early warning mechanism?
Because I reckon that's kind of down to AI and monitoring, and so that there's warnings and kind of anticipation of disasters or extreme weather conditions, so people are prepared. So essentially, I think the technology is there, but it's kind of having the access to the technology. So I think that's probably, so that you're as prepared as you can be. But I think the thing is, is when it's kind of ultimately disastrous, so that the energy is cut out, and as I think on the ground, people just kind of drop into survival technique and kind of somehow find a way through. So essentially, it's just, from all the thoughts that I've had, essentially the people on the ground that deal with the problems that in kind of more vulnerable areas, that day to day they probably figure out ways of doing things, and essentially I think it's kind of figuring out where the best practice is and kind of scaling, and that people that live in the conditions are the ones that probably know most, how to deal with them. So I think the thing is that best practice is always, I think sometimes we tend to not necessarily look at other places that experience the same things, but I think kind of having that connectedness, so that we come from a local level, but we also have a global communication, is really vital, so that we kind of implement things that work in one area.
Thank you, Mr. David Smith. I have last two questions for you. One, what is your advice about the community-based health initiative for emerging economy? And secondly, uh, what you will advise for emerging economy for sustainable finance?
Mhm. Let me add one other thing to Ali's answer, which was an excellent answer. And this is something that I've seen time and time here again. For example, the flood I mentioned earlier, which was a tremendous healthcare disaster. The problem we have, and Ali, I think you're right, the artificial intelligence is an important part of it. Sensors are an important part of it. But what also is an important part of it is what we saw here, is people ignore the warnings. People do not respond in a way like that. We had, you know, I can tell you here, there's so many warnings of severe weather. There's so many warnings of stuff like that that people go, well, it's not going to impact me, or it's not going to be that bad because I've heard this 50 times and only one of the 50 times was bad at all. So we have to do a better job, Sharif, of understanding the models, the digital trends, the simulation, collecting data early, and then being able to disseminate that data in a way that people understand what's serious and what's not serious. The flood I mentioned, coming down that river, it went from 2 feet of water to 47 feet of water in 5 minutes. How, I can say there's a severe flood warning, but a severe flood warning doesn't tell me it's going to go from 2 feet to 47 feet of water coming down that river. And so to be able to build upon what Ali said is you've got to put a way in to better communicate, to better get people's buy-in into doing what you're trying to do with that. And I hate to use an example that was as horrible, horrific as that, but it's actually a pretty good example of what you need to do when you're communicating with things like this. On your other question, Dr. Sharif, I really think we have to go back and look at the intersection of climate change and public health. And, that intersection is a very interesting one because most of the time, health, other than treating people impacting pollution and other things and impacts, they're disconnected. My wife works as a nurse practitioner, and she's responsible for about 30 patients every day in her hospital. And we were actually talking about this a couple of nights ago about how the actual practice of medicine in the hospital is disconnected from what's happening around the hospital outside of the emergency room. And that's to make those connections work, Dr. Sharif, that is one of the collaborations I believe that's necessary, from having someone who works in that domain day after day and coming back there. We also need to look at how we put a really multifaceted type of action together. Now we need to fortify the infrastructure. We need to look at solar powered facilities. We need to look at geothermal facilities. We need to look at wind power facilities. We actually need to go back and look at nuclear type of facilities again as a way to generate clean, sustainable power. And it needs to be done across a multifaceted approach there. We need to look at, yes, telemedicine is part of the solution there during a crisis, but as we've also seen, there's only so much telemedicine can do. So we need to look at more of a hub and spoke type of healthcare distribution plan, where you have very critical care, citywide trauma centers, regional trauma centers, going out to other types of hospitals, going out to other types of distributed emergency rooms, going out to medicine type of rooms, going out to community health. And all of those have to be tied together. So telemedicine by itself is not just the example. Telemedicine calls are really difficult if you're trying to fix a broken leg bone. or if you're dealing with heart attacks, or if you're dealing with somebody who is captured in a flood and have water intake and are drowning. You can't fix those by telemedicine. So you have to begin to look across the broader exchange there to do it. The the others is there's not a shield against that type of disaster and the immediate risk. So you have to put that type of economic vitality into the fabric you have there. You know, the linchpin on part of this goes back to what are the regulatory pieces, what are the financial pieces, how can you put funding in place where governments steward the inclusive partners, where international donors and large national and corporations and philosophic type of people, how can you scale the commitments with accountability? And how do you take the private sector innovation through partnerships and through public-private partnerships and even corporate-to-corporate partnerships to ensure that the responses they cascade in a way to where the most vulnerable can be served, from flood to heat to hurricanes to ice storms and weather to drought. All of those have to be addressed. But if you look at those just as a case example, your response for each of those is a different response. It's not the same response for flooding versus drought. It's not the same response for ice versus a hurricane. So you've got to do it in a multifaceted area. So it's not merely about mitigation. What you really have to do is put a blueprint in place for transformation. And you need to prioritize this transformational strategy uh, to be able to handle the client, the health, and the response and how to get there. And you know, it takes the broader view, not just your local regional view, but the one across your regions and your countries and your global regions, to be able to effectively address the problems you queued up for us, Dr. Shree.
Thank you. Madam Alibrais, what's your closing remarks for today?
Um, Essentially, I think that we be aware that the most vulnerable countries are the poorest, and essentially climate change has probably been created and by the wealthy nations. So essentially, I think to a certain extent the corporation, I would say the petrochemical industries or the chemical industries that definitely that have taken advantage of the resources in those areas that are affecting them, that they should be accountable. And essentially there still needs to be a level of consciousness that we all have about the choices we make. So even here in England, that insulating your house to keep it warm makes sense, so you don't lose heat. Having double glazed, so essentially, everyone needs to make conscious decisions so that they're kind of holding on to what energy they have and what heat they have, or vice versa. If you're a warmer country and you need to keep the heat out. So essentially, I think the thing is, it's a really individual experience and a shared experience as well. And climate change is going to affect us all. And it is really crazy that that you can go from being in Texas, which is where my sister has just lived for almost a decade, and her family, going from drought to flooding, in the space of just a few months. So essentially, the severity and the change from going from one extreme to the other is crazy. And we in this area as well, we're prone to flooding, but it's not devastating or life threatening. Word. So essentially, we're lucky in the fact that in a country where we have kind of relatively moderate weather, we have very, very relatively moderate kind of extreme conditions. So but I think the thing is, it's still it's still our responsibility on a global scale that we're not in a situation we need to change the way we do things.
Thank you. Mr. David Smith, what's your closing remarks for today's session?
Well, I actually agree with everything Ali said, and uh, the comment about her relatives here in Texas is very much true. I mean, if I take Texas out of the United States, we're the eighth largest economy in the world, but yet uh, we went in less than a week from severe drought to severe flooding, uh, and it's rapid. You know, I can go from being 120 degrees during the day, and I have seen temperature fall 80 degrees in one afternoon. And so I can go from below zero to in the hundreds very rapidly as well too. Um, our energy grid is complex. Our water system's complex. Our transportation grid is vulnerable because of the amount of people moving here. And you've got to look at all of these as a system. Uh, Ali, you've heard me say this before. Dr. Sharif, you've heard me say this more than I care to, but everything today in the world has become a system. And if you look at how we look at particularly climate change and healthcare and how you involve the stakeholders in that equation, because it's a very broad, it's not a vertical view, it's a very horizontal view. That is a problem that you have to use system dynamics. You have to use systems approach to solve it. And many of the answers you've gotten today, Dr. Shreve, with how you fund it, how you put the pieces together, how do you respond, lead towards that type of approach, where you have to put frameworks in place, you have to put platforms in place. And that is the way you can begin to tackle such a complex issue as this. But it's totally necessary before we do this. I can tell you that the flooding, which I referred to, and actually Ali referred to in her closing remarks, down the street from me, one of the little girls that was killed at that summer camp was an 8-year-old girl that lives about 3/4 of a mile from me. Another one was a 6-year-old. I have multiple families I know who were impacted by people who died in that flooding. So it's not just a view that says it's a disaster. It affects real people. It affects family. It affects economies. The flooding that just happened here, the prediction is that over 300 businesses are going to go out of business because of that flood. And so that's a big economic impact as well. So it's one of those complex problems, Dr. Sharif. And the approaches you do through your programming, like on the World Health and Economic Program, actually helps us put in place strategies to be resilient in that. So I want to applaud you for this type of program you do, Dr. Sharif. And thank you for letting me be part of it today.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Mr. David Smith, and thank you, Madam Ali Rais, for joining today's session. I request all of our audience, please share our content as much as possible. Besides that, we developed the Center of Excellence in South Asia. So those who need consultancy, those who need research, market research support, those who need technologies, those who need training, they can communicate with World Talent Economic Forum and our scholar, our fellow, like Mr. David Smith, like Madam Ali Rice, like Mr. Rob Enderley. Those who join today's sessions, they're gonna solve all of your complex problem. Definitely, climate change, health is part of these things. Thank you, everyone, for joining today's session. Thank you. Bye bye, and take care.
Thank you.